Hey everyone, good to be here today. So I'm Jason Clark. I work for New Relic. If you've ever installed a New Relic RPM gem, you're probably running some code that I've written. But that has very little to do with what we're here to talk about today. So I figured a conference, Ruby on Ales, it would be appropriate for somebody to kind of talk a little about the beer side of things with a little bit of relationship to Ruby. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. I have been homebrewing since about 2006 and in various capacities and have really enjoyed the process of doing that. And so I want to talk you through how that works, what the process is for making beer yourself, and kind of draw some loose analogies to Ruby and the development space and things that I love about both of these activities. So one of the first questions that probably occurs to a lot of people when they think about homebrewing is why? Why would I brew my own beer? I mean, seriously, I live in Oregon. I live in Portland specifically, which I've seen some statistics recently that suggest that, there's a lot of really good craft brew available. I think that's pretty accurate. I mean, it seems like it is to me. I mean, why would you take something that so many people that are doing it professionally are already taken care of? Why would you do that yourself? I mean, it's a lot like programming, right? I mean, why would somebody try to write a new web server? Why would somebody try to come up with a better way to do that? Have another idea, have another approach. Same thing with operating systems. I mean, we don't need other operating systems. We don't need people to build this sort of technology. It's been done by somebody else already. We don't need other programming languages. Like C and the things that were invented decades ago should be good enough for us, right? Well, clearly that's not true in technology, and I believe that it's also not true in beer. There's a lot to be gained by doing it yourself, experiencing that, and enjoying the output of what you can make. So let's talk a little bit about ingredients. What goes into beer? There are 4 basic components that any sort of fermented beverage is going to have, any sort of beer that you make. First off is water. Most of beer is water. This matters, but not a ton. I mean, for me, I've been able to use my tap water at my house. If you've got tap water that's maybe tastes a little funkier, that you don't like to drink straight out, you might want to look at getting something bottled to be able to take care of that. But most of the time, the water that you're just going to get out of the tap is probably going to be good enough for you. This kind of puts me in mind of how in Ruby, everything has a very simple basis in text, right? If you've been in some other languages, like I came from a C# background, having to deal with all of this compiled stuff and how all of those pieces, it's such a breath of fresh air to have everything just be derived from text and how that works in Ruby. It's a really nice, clean thing that you get there. It's a lot like the water that you use when you brew. The next major component is grain, some sort of grain, typically barley, but there are other variations and things that you can use. This grain has actually been through a process called malting. Now, this is normally taken care of by somebody else. They partially sprout the grain, and then they cook it at a certain point in its life cycle. And all of this is around extracting the sugars that are there in the grain. Those sugars are what are going to feed the yeast and be able to make our alcohol later on when we ferment that beverage. So, once we have this malted grain, you mill it up to break it a little bit, break those structures up, and then you have to go through a process called mashing. Mashing involves holding it at a very specific temperature, about 140 degrees, and you hold it there for a long time so it can convert the dextrins and the maltose into convertible sugars that the enzymes in the brew is going to be able to do. Here's a table that you need to memorize of all the values for all of those things that tell you how much sugar you're going to get out of your grain. But hang on a minute, my first slide had the word simple on it, right? That's not very simple. That's something you can do as a home brewer, but there's an alternative. The sugars that you need to be able to brew are also available as an extract. Now, this makes it so that you end up with a little less control over exactly the flavor of your brew because the extract is going to dictate some portion of the body of your beer. But this makes for really good beer. I primarily do extract brewing, and I've been able to make some very tasty brews based just off of this as the fermentable sugars that go into it. So while being able to extract things all the way from grain is a lot of fun and it's very cool to be able to do that from scratch, you don't have to actually go that far to be able to make your own beer. You know, the malt extract and the sugars in that, it's kind of like your Ruby version. It's sort of like the VM that's there. It's what drives the beer. It's the thing that's the basis for making all of the action happen. And, you know, there's lots of good options and there's lots of good choices for what you want to accomplish, both in your beer and in your Ruby applications that you can choose from. Now, grains play another role when you do extract brewing. So the majority of the fermentation is going to come out of that extract, but there's flavor that you need to give to the beer as well. And so different grains will be used to complement and build on top of that base that you get from the extract. And so here we see some of the specialty grains. It's a fairly small amount that you end up with, depending on the beer. It may be a little more, a little less. Those grains are often toasted or treated in some other way. If you're making something like a porter or stout, it will be very strongly roasted, and there will be some grains that are almost burned that give it the really dark flavor. And various caramel flavors and things that you get in a red ale or an amber are going to come from these flavoring grains. You know, those extra flavors, it's kind of like the gems that you install. You can take from a lot of different places and give a little bit of flavor, a little bit of a spin to your application pretty easily with a small amount of effort. The next major component of beer is hops. Now, hops are there primarily for bittering. So a lot of people don't associate bitterness with being a flavor that they like, but it's actually critical for beer to be able to taste right. If you have a beer that is entirely malty and has no bitter component to it, it really doesn't actually taste that good. You need at least a little bit of bittering edge from the hops to be able to have it be something that's tasty and good to drink. It doesn't have to be an IPA and be overwhelming with the hops, but you're going to want some of that there. Hops come in two different points in time during the brewing that you do. So hops that are put in early in your brew and go across the entire lifetime of the boil that we're going to look at provide the body. They provide the bitter that's part of the flavor of your beer. At the very end, in the last 15 minutes, you also add hops again, and this ends up giving the aroma and the smell. So when you crack a beer open and it's a nice hoppy beer and you get that floral nose to it, that's from hops that were added very late. And there's specific schedules for different recipes of beers that end up giving you different characteristics that way. Hops, for me, it's sort of like customizing your editor. It's something that you need to do, but honestly, if you put too much and you spend too much time on it, it can kind of make things a little sick. Like, you get a too hoppy of a beer, it's just a little too much. The last major ingredient in beer is yeast. The yeast are the thing that take the sugars that we put in, turn it into alcohol, and also add CO2 to the process so that your beer is carbonated. Now, there are multiple types of yeast out there, but there's two major categories. There are lagering, or top fermenting yeasts, and there are bottom fermenting yeasts, which make ales. So you can see the difference here. On the left is a lager. It's very clear. It's very crisp. You can homebrew lagers, but they're actually a little touchier to do. You have to brew them at a very specific temperature. It's around 50 degrees, so you're going to need some sort of refrigeration to be able to carry it on. Ales, on the other hand, are a lot more resilient with the yeast. You can do it at room temperature. There's some of them that even like to be a little bit warmer. Specific yeasts bring a lot of different variety. Uh-oh. That was embarrassing. Oh, isn't that cute? Now I don't know how to get back. What am I doing? All right. Very sorry about that. So, what were we talking about? Yeast. There are actually a lot of Belgian beers which derive a lot of very interesting flavors out of their yeast specifically. They will have flavors of fruit. They'll have the aroma of bananas or bubblegum. And those often come from wild yeast. And in some of these old breweries in Belgium, they actually brew them in a building and just have the vat open while they're doing it. And the wild yeast that have lived in that building, sometimes for centuries, get into the beer and cause it to have that very specific flavor. The yeast that you use dictates a lot about the flavor and character of the beer that's going to come out the other end. Yeast are kind of like your processes. They're the things that drive the action. They're the things that actually run and make your beer happen. They turn those sugars into the output that you're looking for. All right, so let's talk about equipment. What are you going to actually need to be able to brew beer? The first thing that I would suggest is that if you're in an area where you can, find a home brewing shop. I live in Portland, and these are all places that I've been and had good business with. Main Street Brew is out in Hillsborough, so it's a little further away from me, but they were the people that helped us get started. All of these are great options, and homebrew shops are really eager to help you. So they will give you recipes, they'll give you advice, they'll get you set up and get you started. One of the first things that I would suggest is that you get this book. This book by Charlie Papazian is one of the best references for homebrewing that exists. It's easy to read, it's simple, but it has a lot of the information that you're going to need for your kind of beginning to intermediate brewing. You're going to need something to boil your beer in. So this involves a fairly large amount of liquid. If possible, you can get some sort of boil kettle or some sort of large thing. This is my upgraded model that we've gotten. It's actually a keg that's been spigoted at the bottom so I can draw the beer off. You don't have to go that far, though. You can use just a standard sort of stock pot. If you're doing a smaller volume of things, you can boil a smaller amount in the stock pot and then add distilled water at the end to be able to bring it up to the volume that you need. It's also good to have a bucket of some sort. This is helpful during bottling and occasionally during moving the water around when you start out. The grains that we looked at, those specialty grains, you don't want those to get all into the body of the beer, and so you put them into bags that you put in the first stage of things when you're steeping them. You'll also want a thermometer. There's a couple of key temperature points that you're going to have to pay attention to, both on the boil and on the back end of things. Did I mention this book? This book is a really good reference. If you haven't seen this one, this is like the Bible of homebrewing. You should definitely pick that book up. After you've made your beer, it needs some place to rest and it needs some place to ferment. And that's traditionally done in these glass vessels called carboys. So that's about 5 to 6 gallons. And you'll notice I also have a handle on it. That's very important and doesn't get sold with it directly, but man, those things are really tough to lift if you don't have some sort of handle. They're very slick. You'll need an airlock. So this is a clever little plastic device that you fill up with water that makes it so nothing else can get into your beer, but air and CO2 can get out as it's fermenting. It's critical for being able to keep things clean, which we'll discuss briefly in a moment. You'll also need to move your beer around at various stages. And so having a pump with an adequate amount of tubing, and then we'll be looking at how you would bottle the beer. That requires a filler attachment that goes with that pump. Almost last, certainly not least, if you're going to bottle, you're going to need something to be able to cap those bottles. And this is the simplest form of bottle capper. I've been told that there are stand models that are a lot more convenient. And it's a great point about brewing. There's lots of upgrades and things that you can look at incrementally as you go along to be able to make things easier as you're going. I would strongly encourage you as well to take good notes. At the very least, take full ingredient lists of everything that you've put into your beers. One of the saddest experiences that I've had brewing was I made this awesome Armenian Imperial Stout that I absolutely loved. And I went back to try to make it again. And I found the page where I started writing down what I was doing, and I didn't write the ingredients down. And I have no idea what I actually put in that beer. And I can't make it again. Take notes. Make sure that you record what you did so you can repeat the good things later and maybe fix things that didn't go so well the next time around. Did I mention this book? This is a really good book. You should definitely pick it up if you're interested in homebrewing at all. I've heard of a few other books around, but this one's kept me happy and been my go-to reference. All right, so that's all the stuff that we're going to need. Let's talk about the actual process of making beer. What does it look like to actually get down to doing that? First, a word about sanitation. This is a really critical thing when you're brewing because you're basically taking a bunch of liquid and putting yeast into it to go multiply and do whatever it wants to. Now, if there are other microbes or other wild yeasts or things in the environment that get into that beer, it's just like it's the best environment for them ever. It's just like food everywhere, and those microbes will go nuts, and your beer will turn out skunky or weird or have strange flavors to it. So you need to sanitize things thoroughly. Most of the time you do this with either an iodine solution or there are some other alternatives. The liquid, when you mix it up, looks kind of like this. Most things you can soak for a couple of minutes in it, and then you're good. Now, I will say sanitation is really important, but in my early going with brewing, I was really crazy about, I had to have everything super clean, like I was stressed out that my beer was going to like explode if I didn't wash my hands every 30 seconds. Relax. Sanitizing is important, but it's not that touchy. You know, people have been fermenting beverages for literally thousands of years. Like people that had no idea about any of the sanitation stuff successfully made beer long, long before we were alive. So while it's good to keep track of your sanitizing, it's also something that you shouldn't be not enjoying your brewing experience because you're concerned about it. Be careful, and things will turn out well. So the major first section of when you're creating beer is called the boil. You put your water into whatever vessel it is that you're going to deal with. In my case, we do 12 gallons worth of liquid, which is going to yield about 10 gallons worth of beer. There will be some amount of boil off, and that matters based on what shape your vessel is. So if you'll just have to try that out first couple of times and see how much of your liquid you actually lose when you're boiling. Into that, we add the grain, the flavoring grains in the grain bag, and then put that over heat. We use kind of one of those turkey fryer burners on our back porch, but you can do this on any sort of heat source that works out for you. And what you're aiming for is to get it up to 180 degrees. So this is the first point when that thermometer is going to come in handy. At that point, the water will have taken on a very strong color from the grains, especially if you're doing a really dark beer. And you can see sort of how it's bubbled up a little bit. There's going to be some frothing because some of the flavors and some things have been extracted from that grain and gone into the liquid. Once we've taken the grain bags out, the next step will be once the water has actually hit a full boil, we'll add our malt extract in. Now this malt extract is really sticky, heavy stuff. So you want to pour it fairly slowly, and although I'm not actively stirring because I was holding the camera in this shot, you do want to be stirring as consistently as you can while that's going in to make sure that it doesn't stick to the sides and burn or stick to the bottom and just pile up. At this point, your boil is going to start to bubble quite a bit, and you do want to watch it. It can bubble over. You can either turn the heat down, or if you're in some place where you've got like a spray attachment for a hose, you can just give it a little spritz on the top to knock those bubbles down. I feel like this is kind of like the early stages of a project, like when everything's all exciting and you've got all of these ideas that are bubbling up and you're getting ready and things are looking great. The next step, once you're boiling after the extract has gone in, is adding the body hops, the first portion of the hops that are going to give kind of the bitter flavor to your beer. In this case, we used a Fuggle hop, which has an alpha value of 5.1. You can see down there in the corner. The alpha measures how strongly bitter the hops are. Now, there's other flavor and aroma components to it, but that's a measure of kind of how punchy are the hops. Fuggles are not very strong, and so we actually use those in our porter for the body because we don't want it to be really strongly bitter. We just want kind of a moderate influence. A nice side effect of this is that the hops actually kind of coat the top and take care of some of those bubbling issues. So as you go into boiling from there, which we'll be boiling for basically an hour on most of the recipes I've done, you don't have to worry too much past this initial stage of things boiling over. At this point, we've boiled and we boil along, and then at the last couple of minutes, we'll be adding in our hops and for the aroma at the end, so another batch of those. And it feels like, this is where we're like 90% done. Like we're mostly done with the project. The basics are all there. Everything's looking good. And now we're ready for the cool down. So yeast can't survive in boiling liquid. And so we've got this big volume of boiled liquid that we need to eventually get down to a spot where we can put the yeast in. It's helpful if you can, and this is another piece of equipment, is a wort chiller. So this is actually a coil of metal. You hook it up to the hose on one end, and it runs cold water through, and you dunk this down into the beer. You put the wort chiller in a ways before the boil is done to sanitize it, but this will help to kind of speed the cooling process along. That's important because this can really take quite a while if you just let 12 gallons of liquid sit there and wait for it to get down from boiling to a temperature where yeast could be added. The wort chiller will hook over the edge. You know, if you don't have a wort chiller, some of the other options include that you could take distilled water and you could freeze it and add that in to bring up the volume of water, and that would also help you to cool things down. You want to get things down as quickly as you can to 80 degrees. 80 degrees is the sweet spot that you're looking for. That's the point when it's safe to start moving the beer around and adding your yeast in. And frankly, the cool down is like the other 90% of the project. After you're 90% done, it takes such a long time, and it feels like it's just moving a degree by degree and such a long way. But, you know, let it get down to the temperature that it needs to before you move things off. Now, with my brew kettle, I can draw directly off at the bottom, and it'll pull the beer out and do that. If you're doing something in more of a stock pot, you may need to transfer it to another vessel, maybe pouring it through some sort of strainer. This is a point where some other brewers have pointed out that, well, they like to aerate their beer. I honestly don't. I haven't done it with a lot of my batches, and things have turned out decently. But I would be very willing to discuss that with anybody that might have opinions if you want to afterwards. At this point, once we're in the carboy, we can add our yeast in, and then things get to fermentation. Fermentation, you don't actively have to do a whole lot. You put the airlock on, and you put those away in some sort of nice secluded corner, and the yeast will do their business. They will bubble up. I have only had one batch ever actually bubble out of the vessel that I was doing it in. I've seen other people that have a lot more vigorous sorts of fermentation, so you may want to be careful the first few times you do it. It may vary by variety and what yeast you use as well. But it looks something like this. You can see all of the sediment at the bottom. Those are all the dead or dormant yeasts that have fallen out as things are going, and all that nice bubbling at the top. That bubbling is a key sign for you. It will tell you when the primary fermentation is done by how often it bubbles. And so this will get up to the point where maybe every 5 to 10 seconds it'll be bubbling in this airlock. By the time the fermentation is done, you'll maybe be getting a bubble every minute, minute and a half. And at that point, it's time to move the beer over to a secondary vessel. Now, moving it to the secondary is mostly about letting more of that sediment fall out before we bottle things. There will be a little bit of activity. Things will still, there's still yeast and a little bit of sugars left for it to work with, but you get it over there, and at that point, it's time to kind of step away. Like when you finish that bit of code and you're not quite sure that you're done, but you just need a little space to be able to let it breathe, let it take some time, and then come back to visit it. The longer you leave things in secondary, the less sediment you're going to have in your beer, and the better off that'll be at bottling. You can leave beer for quite a while in secondary too. I've left things probably much longer than I should have in a few cases. And at this point, things are fairly static. So once you've done that, then it's time to bottle or do whatever other thing you're going to do if you can keg or something. But bottling is kind of my primary way of doing things. I've actually only bought one case of bottles before because you can recycle bottles that you already have. Like if you drink beer, anything that's not a screw top, you can take that bottle, clean it out, sanitize it, and reuse it again. And I'll often get multiple reuses from the bottles that I've got. Now, that does pose a little bit of an issue for cleaning because obviously you need to be careful that these things get washed out properly. And so I mocked up a little thing with a bottle brush and my drill driver. And yes, that is a taxidermy deer butt on my wall. I can tell you the story about that later if you're interested. But that's how I get the bottles individually clean. And then we run them through the dishwasher. We run it through on the hottest setting. We don't run it through with any soap, any sort of thing like that. But just that heat is enough to make sure that things are sanitized and well prepped for us to be able to bottle. What the approach that we take, and the simplest approach is called for bottling, is bottle conditioning. So when the beer is in secondary, it's flat. the yeast has pretty much done its action, it's worked through, and there isn't really any CO2 left in it. And so the beer would not really taste quite right. So what we do is we add a little bit of sugar, a corn sugar that you can get from the brewing store, mix it up in a little bit of liquid, and then kind of charge the beer with that little bit of extra food for the yeast. The yeast are still there. Like that sediment that you see is not all of the yeast. There's still enough in the body of the beer for it to be able to carbonate itself. And so that's what we do. We feed it a little more so you get the carbonation that you need while it's sitting in the bottles. You boil the caps. So you boil that corn sugar for about 10 minutes. You boil the caps that you're going to put on for about a minute. This will sanitize them and make them safe so that you don't get some sort of contamination into your bottles. And then you move the beer out of your carboy into some sort of secondary vessel that you will bottle from. A carboy with those narrow sort of neck that it has isn't really easy to get the last bits out when you're bottling, and it's a lot easier to do from a bucket. We saw earlier that filler attachment that goes with the pump, so that has a little button on the bottom, so when it's pressed down, the beer flows, and when it's lifted up, the beer stops. And so you put it down into the bottle, get the pump going, and then fill those bottles. We do it right there in the dishwasher, which is nice for cleanup, because you don't get the beer all over. And then the spacing, you fill it right up to the top, and the amount of space that the filler took up is a pretty appropriate amount of headroom for that bottle. So there's actually a little space at the top for gas to be able to collect while it's doing that conditioning. Capping, you put the cap on, you pull the levers, and it seals it up just like any sort of beer bottle you've ever seen. Bottling is great because it lets you share your beer. It's like GitHub, like being able to share your code and give it out to people. Kegging is nice, but I love being able to give beer out and have things that I can take places and share with other people. At this point, once you've bottled as well, though, you need to step away again. Like, I know it's exciting and I know you want the beer and you want to drink the beer that you've just made, but the bottle conditioning takes a couple of weeks, and the honest truth is that most beers will be better another month or two on from the time that you bottle it. They will mature. There's a little bit of sort of a zinginess right after things have bottle conditioned that goes away, and especially with darker, richer beers, you will find that they age well for months after you've bottled them. One of the reasons that I love home brewing, and one of the reasons that I continue to do it, is the variety that you can introduce. Living in Portland, there's a lot of beers. You can get a lot of things. But there's certain things that you're just never going to run into. Like, for instance, we did a Thai pale ale. We took ginger and Thai peppers that we had grown in our garden and lemongrass. And we put that in the boil at the same time as the last round of hops. Now, in this case, the ginger was actually a little too overwhelming, and if we do it again, we'll have to tweak the recipe. But this is not something that you're going to find at a store. It's not something you're going to be able to buy. You can also duplicate things like you might have found, occasionally very expensive things. So we were also inspired to make a oaky bourbon stout. Like, I had these beers that had been aged in bourbon barrels. Well, I took oak chips, soaked them on bourbon, and then put those chips into the secondary for the beer, and then added the bourbon when I bottled it. I was able to come up with a very rich, complex stout of my own that didn't cost like $12 a bottle because it was some crazy specialty thing. Lastly, we made a habanero amber ale. So for those that like spice, this had about 30 habaneros for a 5-gallon batch. It's the beer that you need another beer after because it is spicy. I've had chili beers that I think they maybe paraded a jalapeno in the room where they were brewing. This is not one of them. But this is just an example of the sorts of things that you can do. You can take the brew where you want to take it. It's the sort of variety that I've experienced in the Ruby community. It's such a vibrant place, and there are so many ideas and ways that people approach things that are different than I've seen or different than I might have been able to come up with. And I love that about Ruby, and I love that about brewing. And I think that we should keep that in both of those spots. So, to close, I have some homebrew to share. Some of you may have seen, I'm not sure if I have quite enough to cover everybody, but as we're leaving at the very end of the day, I'll be handing out some bottles. There is a porter recipe that we've made. I call it baby porter because we made the first batch to celebrate when my daughter was first born. And then there's a ruby red ale, which is just a red ale that, ruby, whatever, you got to do that, right? And there's a small number of the habanero amber ales for the brave of heart. So I think that there's a strong chance that many of you in the audience have probably homebrewed as well. So please come up to me, talk to me. I love to talk about this. Tell me where I'm wrong. I think this is probably the most controversial topic I've ever talked on because homebrewers have lots of opinions, and I would love to hear yours. Thank you.